Hi, I'm Richard Walker. I'm the founding editor of the national newspaper and the co-presenter of Full Scottish, which is an online TV news show which is broadcast live from the Yes Bar in Glasgow every Sunday by Broadcasting Scotland. Like most people that live in Scotland, I'm planning to vote Remain in the European referendum next week, but I'm becoming really worried that Britain is about to vote to leave Europe. I think that would be a disastrous result for the UK and a catastrophic result for Scotland in particular. So we're using our show on Sunday to argue the case to remain in Europe. But more than that, we're launching what could be called a television petition, and that aims to convince those people in Scotland who think that the argument is already won in this country that they're wrong and that there is no room for complacency in this referendum and that every vote counts and they have to get to the polls. We're setting up a camera and we're asking anybody who can possibly get to the Yes Bar on Sunday to come along and tell the country why they should vote to remain in Europe. We're relying on your support. I don't care whether you voted yes to the referendum or no in the referendum. This issue transcends that barrier. Come along, tell the country why they should vote Remain. We hope to see you then. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish, coming to you today, as usual, from the Yes Bar in Glasgow.
And today we're delighted to have among our guests Scottish writer A.L. Kennedy. Alison is an award-winning author with 17 books under her belt, as well as being a dramatist for stage, film, television and radio. She writes for a whole bunch of UK and overseas publications, including The Guardian Online.
We're welcoming back Angela Haggerty, editor of The Common Space and a freelance journalist.
Rob Henworth is Vice President of the National Union of Students in Scotland.
Robbie Dinwoodie is a freelance journalist and political editor of iScot magazine.
And it's good to welcome back Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp. Gordon is founder and CEO of Business for Scotland.
And music today comes from an upcoming singer-songwriter from Edinburgh, Megan D.
So, right, we're going to start off with looking at the newspaper headlines today. As you might expect, EU referendum related items are everywhere. Probably there's very little else in the newspapers barring Tom Peake, really, I suppose.
Today's Sunday Herald, Joe Cox, very sad news about Joe Cox on the front page.
The Mail on Sunday is a news report on the appearance in court of the man charged with Joe Cox's murder, and when he was asked for his name he identified himself as Death to Traitors.
Today's Observer, Tim Peake on missing being in space, and Britain split down the middle apparently in the Brexit referendum.
Sunday Times Scotland is no turning back, says Cameron. The Sunday Times is coming out for leave in comparison to the Times, Daily Times, which has already stated its allegiance to Remain.
Sunday Telegraph, Mr Gove's telling us that Brexit won't cause a recession.
Sunday Mail, I think this is a great front page. Some people might disagree and we'll be talking about it later, but this is Vote Peace, clearly arguing for a Remain vote in a very different style. So yeah, we'll talk about whether newspapers should do these sort of things later on.
Angela, Brexit, and we're talking about newspapers, we've looked at the headlines. Mm-hmm. Who's in, who's out, who's staking a claim, who's sitting on the fence?
I've actually very handily written this down on my tiny little note paper. We've got, I'll maybe not go through it all, but we've got a good mix between the dailies and the Sundays of people back in Remain and people back in Leave. We've had a few interesting ones that people have found. I noticed this actually on Twitter last night. The MP Natalie McGarry put out a tweet saying she was confused because the Times was back in Remain and the Sunday Times was back in Leave. But I think if we all remember, that's what happened in the independence referendum. We had the Herald backed a no vote and the Sunday Herald backed a yes vote, so it's not necessarily that unusual. And I think people don't understand that dailies and Sundays have different editors and actually different teams a lot of the time. They could be quite different brands as well. So we've seen a bit of movement there. We've got the Daily Mail. I don't think actually has officially backed Leave yet, has it? I mean, we assume that it probably will, but I don't think it's done it yet.
Yeah.
But the Mail on Sunday, they've backed Remain, interestingly. That surprised a few people. We've got The Sun that's gone for leave. That was a few days ago.
That was The Sun in England.
It's Sun in England,
Yeah,
yeah. It's
yeah.
not in...
Sun in Scotland hasn't done that.
Yep, on the fence, as we were saying earlier. But I mean, I agree. I don't know if we can get the Sunday Mail front page back up.
I'm rummaging.
Yep.
There we go.
There it is.
That's, I mean, I think that, I agree with you, Richard. I think that is an absolutely fantastic front
Yeah.
page. It's one of those, I think, when you have these big kind of historic votes, or you know, kind of like the Sunday Herald did with the yes vote, and it was a real, you know, people have that image framed up
I
in,
do.
up in
I have
their,
it.
Yeah, they do.
because it's one of those things that you will look back on. I think that's a really powerful front page, and I'm not of the belief that newspapers shouldn't back decisions. I think it's helpful for people. I think you need to have a good variance of that, which we didn't have during the independence referendum. We only had the Sunday Herald. But it's nice to see these kind of big, bold front pages where they're really making the case for something, for values that people might believe in, and I think that does help people make up their minds and figure out what's most important for them.
Although this page was in the paper review on BBC Radio this morning, somebody looked at this page and asked what they'd been smoking. What piece? So again, I suppose we'll talk about cynicism and idealism later on.
So why is it so important, Alison, do you think, that newspapers voice an opinion and lead perhaps from the leader column?
Well, voicing an opinion I'm not so sure about, because an opinion might not be fact-based, and the trouble is that we have this sort of perfect storm of, I mean, how long do you want me to go on for? There isn't really the budget for investigative journalism. It's much easier to do what they're calling journalism, to do non-fact-based PR handouts and to just recycle them. So there's an absence of fact for purely economic reasons. You've got politicians who, particularly since Blair, have been faith-based politicians. I can say I believe there are weapons of mass destruction, even if when you read the report that apparently justifies going to war and spending billions of pounds and killing hundreds of thousands of people, because you know there's nothing in that report that actually substantiated that move. But I believe, I feel, and that's a whole change in language that came in particularly at that point. So we've moved very, very far from a fact-based debate. What we now have is something which, of course, if you're going to go on emotions and opinions and beliefs, the louder and the more extreme the opinion and the belief and the emotion, the more attention you'll get. If you aren't going to spend money on investigative reporting, then it's easier to get, you know, somebody like a Farage-like figure or a Trump-like figure, because he's extraordinary and he's a little bit freakish and you can stare at the car crash that is this man and his opinions. But obviously, if you're marinating people it's like the morning hate. If you're marinating people in an ambient hatred, and if the message is focusing and focusing and focusing and repeating on, at the moment, it's brown people, it's the foreign threat, it's the other, you're about to be destroyed. We absolutely know what happens to countries where the culture gets degraded to that point. It's not good news. It wasn't good news in Rwanda, it wasn't good news in Germany, it wasn't good news in former Yugoslavia, it wasn't great news in Chile. No country is ever going to be exactly the same, no history is going to repeat itself exactly, but we know about situational pressure. We know that people are influenced. That's why there's advertising, that's why politicians frame things in the way that they frame things. At the moment we have a remarkably vapid, undereducated, extremely career-driven and emotionally traumatised governing class from a very small sector of British society fighting amongst themselves with the help of their friends in the media, or the people who are blackmailing them who own the media. But they've dragged us into a fight, and while they and some of the pop columnists are just going for, clicks, they may or may not be cynical about the hatred that they're peddling. But this drags in the whole population, and there are people out there with funny opinions already, but if you legitimise them, and there's no pushback from reality, and everything is framed, if somebody gives a fact and you come back with, but isn't that being fear-mongering, is that immediately everything gets dragged into emotion again, and we're not saying, this report says this, that report says that. Everything gets dumbed down and is just shouted. You know, that becomes enormously dangerous, and it has an effect that's absolutely predictable. And if there's no pushback from what you would say would be the progressive, intellectual, liberal media, because there's this kind of learned helplessness from there, or just lifestyle. Let's just talk about quinoa and hemp trousers. So, well, okay, you could do that, but culture develops by default. And if you're not entering into a debate, and if you're not saying, well, actually, we have a role to play in society, and it's not that culture will stop happening, it will just happen by default, and it will be about celebrity gossip and hatred. And if you soak people in that, people get anxious, people get grumpy.
There's a whole bunch of lines, there's a whole bunch of lines that I'll go back to, but Robbie, you were...
Yeah, you want to come in on that?
We're going to come to where the climate of hate takes us. But while we're with the newspaper review, I mean, I'm a traditionalist in the sense that I like my papers to be divided into clarity in terms of where there's fact, where there's statistical analysis, all that kind of thing. Opinion is fine. I don't even mind a front page editorial on the eve of a big event, as long as it's clearly labelled as editorial. I think you can fairly say with the Sunday Mail's one today, that's in that nature. The referendum is this week. They're nailing their colours to the mast. They've done it in a highly unusual way. I have to say, it certainly probably would have appealed to today's Sunday Herald readers. I don't know how it will go down with the Sunday Mail's own readers, but I think it was brave of them to give it a shot. Elsewhere, the real problem we've had, and this has been stretching back some years, is the way in which fact and opinion in too many of the papers have become blurred. And you know, an awful lot of the stuff you read in the so-called mid-market tabloids is actually opinion dressed up as news, and that can be very dangerous.
Gordon, I mean, when the brand differentiations, I guess, does it, as a reader, does it confuse you when the Times takes one line, the Sunday Times takes another line, or indeed when the Sunday Herald took one line and the Herald takes another line? Is that confusing?
It doesn't confuse me, but I think it can be confusing overall. People don't realise the separation of the different papers, and I think that Sunday Mail front page is actually probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't what you'd done when you were editor of the Sunday Herald, when you took that stance. I think a lot of the sort of the ways that newspapers are now actually realising that there are some huge issues at stake here, and they're thinking, right, let's take everything off the front page and let's just go with one solid message because we think it's that important, is an important step in the evolution of newspapers, because it's becoming about causes. And that's what social media is about. And social media is driven by causes. There's an echo chamber where people start to share less about themselves and more about causes happening in social media. And so the whole of the media environment is changing. And I think if a newspaper is going to survive, it has to take a stance and it has to appeal to niches. They can't now appeal to everyone. I think that's what we're seeing here.
Rob, your generation, you're going to be a spokesman for everybody under 40. Your generation, newspapers are not much of a thing for them. Social media and the internet is a huge thing for them. I guess, do newspapers, does this, I guess, the front page like the Sunday Mail, does that appeal more to your generation? Do you want to see newspapers take a stand, take a line, do something imaginative, or are newspapers dead to you anyway? It doesn't really make any difference.
I think what's interesting is that all of the front pages we've seen today say something very similar, that this debate is about the level of the nation state, it's about Britain's role in the world. Even that Sunday Mail front page, it's in red, white and blue, and it says Britain should be a force for something in the world. But the comparison with social media is very apt, because the debates we've seen around the EU through that sort of outlet have been about communities, about people's experiences and the opportunities that we have to interact on a global platform. So it's not just that newspapers aren't a medium that are reaching younger generations. It's also that they're having a completely different conversation. I'm very proud that NUS has led the conversation about social Europe, about students and workers who find their way to Scotland and the rest of the UK to work and study here, and also those of us who are lucky enough to go abroad and study and work elsewhere, because that's what really builds peace across Europe. It's community. And being able to interact with people from different backgrounds and different cultures, not the role of nation states and conflicts in high politics.
In the days of social media, how much influence does a newspaper have in shaping the debate, Angela? Because you work for Common Space, an online publication or an online organisation, which takes a stand. It was born of the independence referendum, really. Do you think newspapers can still, in this area, in this world, change people's minds?
Yeah, I do. I think that we, people that are understandably angry at the mainstream media, as we often call it, probably wish that wasn't true, but I think it is true. I think that when you get those really powerful front pages, like the Sunday Herald with IndieRef, or maybe the Sunday Mail today, with the European referendum, I think it still has an impact. A newspaper taking a particular line gives an argument a sense of legitimacy or credibility about it that it might not otherwise have had. So that's why in the independence referendum, the Sunday Herald taking that decision was a massive thing. If people will remember that at the time, it was huge. And I think that papers taking the leave position on the EU referendum lends a kind of legitimacy that takes some of the fear out of it, I think, for would-be leave voters who are maybe a bit kind of tentative about what it might mean. But when a big newspaper backs it, well then it can't be that bad, can it? It can't be that much of a disaster if X number of national newspapers think that there's a case to be made there. So absolutely, I do think that newspapers do still play quite an important role in the bigger conversation, which is why you need to have that variance between the different positions that they're taking. And not just that, I mean, you might have papers that are more on the right that take a Remain position and papers that are more on the left that take a Remain position, and they're going to make very different cases for that. So it's kind of covering many arguments and many different ideas within those arguments, and I think that's been something I've been quite pleased to see actually with the EU referendum, is just that variety in views.
Newspapers they've become less radical, I think, recently. And if you look at this, there's a split between Remain and Leave across the newspapers, and that actually is good for the democratic debate. In the independence referendum, we didn't have that until pretty much later on. And so essentially, if you think, oh, well, it's good there's a split, but you have to remember that Remain is actually the status quo. Remain is the establishment position. So it's actually quite unusual that there are people taking newspapers going against the establishment position, and that hasn't happened in the independence debate, and it probably won't next time either to a large extent. And if you have newspapers as a whole taking one political position because they're owned by people who are part of the establishment, then that's actually an assault on democracy, and that's a problem, and that's where social media is starting to break down barriers, because the people who actually get more information that sort of opposes the establishment, they're willing to actually take a risk and vote. And older folks who are less on social media, it said, were against independence because they didn't have that channel.
I wonder whether there's anything in that. I mean, because I think that voters were failed in the Scottish independence referendum in that lack of media variety. There was one paper, the Sunday Herald, and it was only a weekly newspaper, it wasn't a daily newspaper, that backed the yes case. Now, within that, you then social media did play a much more crucial role, I think, in the independence referendum than I think that we've seen in the EU ref. And you also had the growth of things like Wings Over Scotland and Bella Caledonia, Newsnet Scotland, iScot magazine, and then later on Common Space, because there's something had to come in and fill that gap. It became clear that the media wasn't going to perform, it wasn't going to do its duty in that sense. I think we've seen less of that in the EU ref. We have had much more variety, even though some people would say it's still, the debate's very, very much still been maybe in certain areas about immigration and other things. But even at that, there was a variety that exists with this that didn't exist in the independence referendum, and we haven't seen a growth of new media in England like we did in Scotland.
Well,
maybe
you're beginning to. I think the gift of that failure to Scotland is now slightly happening in Britain, just because it has been so toxic, and you're walking through, just wandering around past newsstands. It's just this slab of loathing. But I mean, for a very long time, the sort of commercial decline of newspapers has meant there is a moral obligation, and if you ignore it, then basically you've made a step to the dark side. I mean, I remember 20 years ago talking to a prominent editor about coverage of the Holocaust, and he was slightly drunk, but I mean, he honestly face to face said, it wouldn't have been a sexy story. It wouldn't have sold enough. And it's like, seriously? Is that, there's this definite decision to step away. And again, this changes to legislation, which people were worried about at the time under Tony Blair, guess what? That meant you were going to go to this kind of situation where people are drinking their own Kool-Aid, where you're just going for the popular story and the shouting story, and there's no sense of, in a civil society, you have to be trying to maintain, to pull people who are trying to avoid facts back to dealing with facts.
Yeah,
and an underlying sense that your front page should always be, whatever you think, let's go for peace, because otherwise we don't have a civil society.
One of the problems is, I accept there is more balance, especially with companies splitting their titles between the two sides. The trouble is that the more liberal papers, small l, who are doing a fairer job, and less strident, their supporting Remain, but they are actually trying to report all sides of the debate, whereas the Brexit papers are so much more strident, so much more misleading, so much more selective, and so less likely to give space to the other side and give a balance.
You write for iScot?
Yeah.
And you could argue that Scotland's media landscape now is quite varied if you look at it in the round. I mean, mainstream papers probably less so, but there's a whole bunch of things that have been springing up. I mean, iScot's quite well established. It's not a result of their independence, but nevertheless, there is now a kind of diverse media. Are we not doing quite well here?
Well, I think that it demonstrates that there is room. There is space, and maybe that's been caused by the monolithic nature of the media. I think you've also got to remember that actually newspapers themselves are becoming part of the social media, because their websites are becoming very important to them. And in the same way that people will turn to Common Space or Bella Caledonia, because that fits their own worldview, people will continue to turn to newspapers, whether in print or online, because they think that paper reflects their worldview. People are far more likely to read the paper they already believe in than be influenced by newspapers to believe in something else. And that is just the way newspapers always have been, but it's migrating onto line as well.
Yeah, but it's become quite cynical. I mean, if you put on an outrageous Katie Hopkins piece, people who agree with her will click and give income to your website, and people who are finding out how terrible it was today, who want to look at what will also click. You're just making money. It's this amoral money-making machine which inadvertently is dragging us all into much more heightened conversations than are safe.
Opinion porn.
Yeah.
Speak more about
opinion.
Oh, was it? Okay.
But no, I totally agree. I mean, you don't get people clicking on your website unless you're putting something out there that forces people to go, I need to find out what's been said today. That's outrageous, or at last someone's speaking my truth. Yeah. So you click on it, and then down the right-hand side there's all these links to paid links, etc. And that's how they make money. And it's undermining the role of journalism in society. And I think we've all seen that. And I'm the only one here probably that's not actually been a proper journalist. But okay.
Everybody's madly distancing themselves. I'm not a journalist.
But what is a proper journalist nowadays? And the thing about
12-year-old blogger that you don't have to pay anything.
Almost all of my news now comes from links shared on social media, and I tend to, because I'm now in the echo chamber of friends who are sharing similar views with me, etc. I have to go out and look for stuff that disagrees with me in order to educate myself.
And that's right, because it's not just about opinions either, it's about what people are interested in. And I think certainly my generation has been very badly served by national media around this referendum, because if the whole debate is about house prices and the state of the economy, what's that got to do with me?
You'll never own a house.
Well, exactly, yeah. It doesn't mean anything to people my age. So we're seeing all these stories.
It's got a lot to do with your generation.
Of course,
it's really important to them.
But it's difficult to relate it to our everyday lives. Whereas the conversations that we want to have about Europe are about the people that we live and work with and the opportunities that we've got, not about what, without wanting to be rude, business people who are already well into their careers are going to get out of a trade settlement.
That wasn't terribly rude. But you're young, I'll let you get away with it.
I'm kind of interested in the split between the business case for staying and the emotional case for staying. I mean, we're going to see quite soon Business for Scotland's information on the economics around this argument. But there is, for me, there needs to be a bit of an emotional element as well, and I'm wondering whether that's been missing a little bit from...
No. What you've got is a very toxic emotional atmosphere.
Okay.
It's partly coming from the world of business, not the world of saying factual business, but this thing of, if you go into the job interview and you're positive and you smile and you make eye contact and everything has to be upbeat and then you'll get the job. It's like, no, factually you're still quite unlikely to get the job. And that's going into Department of Work and Pensions. They'll give you therapy so that you're not depressed by having no money and no home and being in constant pain, because you have to think positively, because that's the crazy fixed smile business model. So there's this whole world of, again, unemotion. You've got this sort of unfocused rage of dispossessed people and this bizarre, no, we can exit and it will all be fine because we all have a fixed smile, and no, never mind the figures, we're going to do what you're supposed to do in the Hollywood business model where good people are rewarded with good things and we don't quite know how that's going to happen, but hey, it'll be fine. It's like, no, there are figures, there is reality. People who are in pain are depressed. People who are depressed are in pain. That's real. Department of Work and Pensions is now, it's not about health and security, which it used to be, because we don't have health and we don't need security and we don't need safety. Health and safety is now a bad thing. There's this whole denial of genuine pain, the denial of genuine grief. You should just give yourself a good shake and go forward. And a very peculiar emotional landscape before you get to the press, who have for 20 years gone into an interview with, how do you feel? Don't tell us what happened, tell us, and how do you feel? Don't tell us, what the details were or what the facts are. Don't get an expert on television and give them more than 3 seconds to talk about anything, because maybe they'll run out of things to say. And I mean, they don't run out of things to say. That's the cult of the phone-in, isn't it? You get all these phone-in programmes. When I hear a phone-in programme, I think, actually, they're cheap. But I think, actually, I'd rather listen to someone who knew what they're talking about than someone pumping their guns.
What you've just described isn't a business model, it's a neoclassical political model, and it's the ethics that go with that. That's nothing to do with business.
No, but I mean, they present themselves as being business. No, I'm not maligning real business.
Well, that's the point I wanted to make, is that 98% of the companies that are formed in Scotland are SMEs. They're family-owned businesses, people who create jobs for 10, 20, 30, 40, sometimes up to 1,000 people. That's the sort of businesses that join Business for Scotland. And they care about growth in the economy, not so as they can get richer, but so as we can all share in prosperity, and that's what drives us. So I think that the constant tirade that I hear against business is actually misaligned. It needs to be targeted against financialisation of our lives by major corporates, because I find there's absolutely no contradiction in my being anti-big finance, anti-global corporate, but pro-business.
And that would be you not being dynamic and thrusting. And I mean, it's crazy. I know it's crazy. It's not to do with...
It's not at all. That's the thing. We've got the wrong image of what business is all about.
I think,
I'm totally agreeing with you.
When you put somebody on television who is the chief executive of a big PLC, who's been a salaried person all their lives, they've had to buy into a culture and say yes to get to that position. When you put somebody who's created a company that actually has an environmentally sound product and employs 150 people, they're a hero. The other person is a salaried yes man. Who do we listen to? And our culture tells us to listen to the PLC. But that's actually the person we shouldn't be listening to. We should be looking to who's actually creating wealth and jobs and value in our society.
And that's why that voice was against Scottish independence, because that's the voice of your identity not as a citizen but as a consumer, and these supranational corporate entities that don't pay tax, that don't contribute, that just ravage, and the nation state being balanced against that. And again, you're not allowed to have that conversation.
There was a fabulous survey of, I can't remember what paper it was that published it. It might have been the Herald that published it. But they basically surveyed the chief executives of the top 100 companies in Scotland and asked them whether they were stay or leave. And I think only about 26% were yes for independence. And my view was, so you've taken a group of people who are stereotypical Tory donors and future lords, and you found 26% are pro-independence. Oh my God,
amazing.
That's
Indeed. Well, we're going to get back into the business case for remain soon, but first...
First, we're going to have some music. We have a fantastic young singer-songwriter from Edinburgh. Her name's Megan D. She's going to join us now and play and sing for us. Welcome, Megan.
We're a bit of a squeeze this week, indeed.
Snug. What's it you're going to play for us, Megan?
I'm going to play one of my own songs. It's called Out in the Ocean, and I wrote it about kind of just doing your own thing, thank you, and not being like dragged down by other people sort of thing, just kind of being your own person, independent sort of thing, yeah.
Well, we're all for independence here.
Okay. I don't want to be that version of me anymore, 'cause there are places I want to be and things that I want to see that I haven't seen before, and now I'm free to be what you never let me be. So I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, just me, myself, and the breeze. Oh, I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, 'cause I believe everything you told me to believe. Oh, I believe, oh, I believe, oh, I believe. I don't know why it's passed me by so many times before, but when I looked into your eyes, I fell for all your lies, and I'm not falling anymore, 'cause I'm free to be what you never let me be. So I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, just me, myself, and the breeze. Oh, I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, 'cause I believe everything you told me to believe. Oh, I believe, oh, I believe, oh, I don't know if you can hear me, but I see things so clearly now that I've got no place to be. It's funny, I've never felt so free. Oh, I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, just me, myself, and the breeze. Oh, I'm trying to swim out in the ocean, 'cause I believe everything you told me to believe. Oh, I believe, oh, I believe, oh, I believe.
Thank you. That was beautiful, wasn't it?
Yeah, thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
That was great.
We're just going to see a video now which is made by a business for Scotland. Gordon, can you tell us a bit about the video before we see it? What's it aimed at doing?
Well, essentially, the narrative of the EU campaign from London is one thing, but it's not. It wouldn't have the same impact. A Brexit wouldn't have the same impact in every part of the UK. So we wanted to do specific economic research and look at the financial situation here, and actually try and figure out what impact the EU has to Scotland's economy, to our communities, to job creation, etc. And we found that it would have a vastly different impact. We came to the conclusion that the EU is far more important to us than it is to the UK as a whole. But the press in Scotland, the media in Scotland, have actually allowed the whole UK narrative to dominate the front pages here. So basically we thought, well, we're going to have to get this out ourselves. And as of this morning, when I looked at it, the video's on Facebook and on YouTube, and it's about 107,000 views. So the message is getting out there, and we've got a big push coming Monday to email it out to another 50,000 people. So hopefully the message is getting out.
Good luck with that.
Yep.
Let's
Let's
have a
watch the
watch.
video.
The UK media present the financial and economic implications of a Brexit vote as if it would have the exact same impact on all parts of the UK. But our research has shown that a Brexit would impact far more negatively on Scotland's economy. The cost of the UK's annual EU membership is £8.4 billion. Now the Leave campaign claim it's £17.8 billion. Actually they round it up to £18 billion. But the UK never pays that amount, as several other EU member countries chip in to pay £4.9 billion of our membership fees for us. And then the UK receives another £4.5 billion back in EU grants. Now Scotland pays 8.4% population share of the UK's EU fees, but draws down 17.4% of the EU spending in the UK. Thus, you can see the EU plays a vital role in redistributing the overly concentrated investment and wealth of London and the South East back to Scotland. So that's £1.1 billion for a membership, but we get back £782,600,000. Once you also subtract the research grants to Scottish companies and the aid component of our membership that we're committed to pay anyway, Scotland's EU membership fee is £97 million, so that's £18 per head per year. 97 million gets Scotland tariff-free access to the common market, which generates £7 billion of Scotland's GDP, or economic turnover, which then creates around £2.2 billion of tax revenue per year. Less than 97 million, Scotland's net benefit from EU membership is approximately £2.1 billion per year. So for every £1 that Scotland gives the EU, we get at least 20 back. To maintain the trading benefit and access to the common market, there are only 3 post-Brexit trading choices: the Norwegian, the Swiss, and Canadian options. The Norwegian option is the only one that offers full trade access and could also be done within the required 2-year timetable following a Brexit vote. Norway, however, has to pay 95%, and the Swiss, with limited market access, pay 56% of the UK's EU membership fee per head, whilst receiving 0 EU spending in return. So there'll be little or no membership fee saving for the UK following a Brexit, but actually a significant financial loss for Scotland. However, both Norway and Switzerland still require to allow EU immigration, to follow EU regulations and EU product standards, but they have no MEPs or no European Council members to vote or influence on these regulations. So they still have to pay, but they get no say. The Canadian option, a TTIP style free trade deal, would typically take about 7 years to negotiate and would offer limited market access. Canada, like Switzerland, has no financial sector access, making it a completely unworkable solution for the UK. Leave campaigners claim that getting rid of EU legislation would make the UK economy more productive and far more competitive. But actually this could only be done if you undo EU legislation that protects workers' rights, such as holiday pay entitlement, maternity pay, the working time directive that limits how many hours you can be forced to work every week, health and safety rules, age, gender and race discrimination at work, and also the overall human rights which are intrinsically linked to our EU membership. Every employer that I have spoken to thinks that removing workers' rights at a time when wages are squeezed and job security remains low, and when confidence in the economy is also so low, that could create employee morale issues, union opposition, and actually lead to significantly weakened productivity and significantly weakened competitiveness. As Scotland attracts so much EU spending and exports far more per head than the UK as a whole, EU membership is far more important to us, and our EU membership creates more, better paid and higher quality jobs for the people of Scotland.
Gordon, that's a great video. Do you presumably think that the economic case has not been put properly beforehand?
Not at all. In fact, I think we're into a sort of post-truth politics now, where and I think it goes to what you're saying about faith before. You know, people are just making opinionated statements and not actually getting to the facts. We've got to educate people and allow them to make their own decisions. Now, for me, this is a fairly obvious. Once I realised that we paid 8.4% of the fee and then got 17.4% of the EU spending, I realised that the EU's role is actually counter to London's role of sucking all wealth, jobs and opportunity towards London and the South East. It actually brings some of it back. So whilst we're still in the UK, we need to stay in the EU because it actually helps our economy against the centralisation of Westminster.
Alison, when we were watching that video, you made an interesting observation about the graph that was showing.
Yeah, well, I mean, and particularly living in London now, you are surrounded by turkeys who consistently vote for Christmas and kind of love it. It's a very peculiar cycle, but you know, and I think because you've got to the point where there's this horrible constant psychological dissonance, where the reality that you're being peddled by the newspapers is so different from the actual reality, and the aspiration is that you're going to be an aristocrat or you're going to be a wealthy footballer, and you're just not getting it, and you've got a whole raft of young people who have no future because we gave it away, we sold it, and you're just at a point where, particularly England, because the identity has been British, and that isn't really working anymore. You've got this huge moment of crisis, and just when you need everybody to be really calm, we decided to have a massive job interview that drags us all very close to something very ugly, because the rhetoric is all about the loudest thing they can think of, which is hatred and fear and whatever. But you've got, the graph is very peculiar. If you look at people who are most likely to be in favour of leaving the EU, they're most likely to be impacted more horribly than anybody else by the leaving, but they've been told the opposite. I mean, it's great. It shows you the influence all of these media people and newspaper people say, oh, we're amazed that all of this unpleasantness is happening, despite the fact we've been feeding you horror forever. I mean, it's very influential because it's actually managed to make a whole generation, multiple generations, vote against their own interests over and over and over.
And that's undoubtedly true in London. But if you come out to the north of England, it's even worse, because there they even feel that there is no attention on them. We've been ignored for so long. Scotland had its day in the sun a couple of years ago. London is constantly the centre of everything. So you've got this real angst-driven feeling of being ignored and disdained and looked down upon. And that's, I mean, there was a piece in The Guardian the other day where Polly Toynbee went into one of the main call centres operated by the Labour In campaign, just to hear what was going on, made a few of the calls, spoke to Labour voters in the north of England, expecting to get a decent number of Remainers, and heard this relentless Brexit response, because these people just feel they've been left behind by a kind of metropolitan view.
Can I just bring Rob in just for a minute, just because I'm interested to know what are the issues around this that are particularly relevant to your people, students, and I guess younger people? What is it that's getting them engaged with this, if indeed they are?
Getting younger people and students engaged has been particularly difficult. We know that students are overwhelmingly in favour of remaining in the EU, but getting them to the polling stations on the day is going to be very difficult. And I think that's largely to do with the conversation we had earlier about what story is being painted in the media and how distant that is from people's everyday lives. In terms of the things that are interesting students, opportunities to study and work abroad, which are so much easier within the EU than they would be otherwise. We're talking about the the money that goes into colleges and universities that comes directly from the EU, especially distributing money to colleges in poorer areas and offering skills for work that just simply wouldn't be happening if we were outside of the European Union. But I think there's some other interesting things that were in that video just there that the younger people want to be talking about in this referendum as well. I think it was really exciting to see the points made about workers' rights. Holiday pay, sick pay, protection when businesses are restructuring for workers, especially in precarious jobs, which for my generation is absolutely what we're experiencing. It's interesting that even David Cameron and George Osborne, people who are not, for the most part, fans of workers' rights, have been going out and campaigning for a settlement that includes those protections. And that seems to be, for me, one of the really exciting things about the European project. Even the most right-wing government in my lifetime has been able to match together protection for workers and benefits for society in general.
Yeah, and we've been allowed to forget that, for example, the European Human Rights Law that we keep being told is evil and is intrusive. I mean, that whole court was started by English lawyers, by British lawyers, because there was nobody left alive. I mean, we were part of that project that was heading towards human rights and remembering what happens when you don't have them. And you look at Boris. I mean, Boris single-handedly has been drip-feeding fake stories about straight bananas, about conkers with eye protection, you can't play them without eye protection, about the minimum age under which you can't blow up a balloon. He's spent decades feeding nice, juicy, slightly bizarre, nicely balanced stories to newspapers, and by the end of it we forget that the EU, okay, there's an awful lot going on that you might want to adjust, but there's an underlying project that's about human rights and about opportunity and about trying to balance up redistribution of wealth and redistribution of power.
Gordon, you were wanting to make a point, and I was wanting to bring in Angela to discuss stuff, campaigns, and the standard of both sides of the campaigns.
All I was going to say was just agree with Robbie. The situation in the northeast of England and Hexham in Northumberland's my hometown, and for every £24 spent on infrastructure in London or the southeast, there's only £1 spent in the northeast. They don't have devolution. Okay, they voted against it, but it was one of those sort of rigged elections where opinion was telling them this was a waste of money, all those sort of things. So it's kind of interesting that in the northeast and the northwest even, there is a big argument that the EU is undemocratic, but actually the failure is in a lack of democracy in the northeast and the northwest, because if they had devolution, they'd have a local government standing up for them, fighting for projects which could bring down EU funding, 50-50 matching, etc., which is what the Scottish Government does, which is why it brings in so much money. So essentially the democratic failure is not in the EU, the democratic failure is locally within the UK, that we don't have federalism and devolution throughout the whole of the UK. It's kind of like quite an interesting failure of their argument.
In terms of, common space readers, similar, I suppose, to readers of the National and the Sunday Herald, they're very engaged politically in the independence debate still. I find it really hard to get people as interested in the EU referendum story in any sense at all. Maybe more recently it started, but to begin with, really hard. Did you find that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's such a contrast, even I would say, to the general election last year. Some of the coverage that we were doing around there, the traffic was just going through the roof. For EU ref stuff, it's really kind of, it's like pulling teeth sometimes trying to get people to read it. And this is kind of one of the things that sort of bugs me a little bit about the kind of, it's the media's fault that the debate isn't here and it's over here, is that we've approached it, and there's two things that we do. One is that we cover the campaigns themselves, because that's what media should do. We should be reporting what the main campaign groups are saying, what cases they're making. That's just bread and butter reporting, that's part of it. We've approached it in the other sense with doing like a series of explainers and feature articles, explainers, so that it's more just about trying to get into the facts and get into the statistics. That way we think people might trust the information a bit more if it's not in the format of a news report. But trying to get people to read those articles compared to the ones that have got a really, really nice kind of line on, a really nice hook, something about IndieRef 2, for example. You can see the difference in the traffic. You can create the content, but you can't make people read it. And that's the tricky thing.
And this is the thing about online media.
We can't force people to be interested in the things that we would think are more important, talking about human rights, talking about the other side, workers' rights, and not just about immigration and the economics of that. But we see that the views on that, even for an engaged audience, are far lower than they are on those things that we hate, the clickbait stuff, but people will read that. So this is a tricky thing for us in media, is how do we get around that? How do you get people to be a bit more interested in those other things?
If Taylor Swift back.
But this is we know that people do respond to that stuff in media, and that's why campaigns use those tactics, because they know they're much more likely to get into people's minds, get their lines out there if they sort of follow that. It seems to just be this never-ending cycle. And yes, the media is at fault, but also a question for me, not just as a journalist, but as a consumer of media as well, is do we need to take a bit of personal responsibility there for the stuff that we read and that we choose to consume? I'm as guilty of it as everybody else for clicking on the article, some showbiz nonsense about someone that's had an affair or something else.
You shouldn't feel guilty about
it.
People have got a wide range of opinions. I'm sure there are some moments in the day where you want to read about Taylor Swift and Calvin Harris, and there's nothing to feel guilty about that. But it doesn't mean to say you're not going to be interested in other things. I think people are quite capable of switching from one thing to another.
I think you made a point, Richard, about there's not really been an emotional connection in this referendum campaign the way there was 2 years ago. Now, perhaps it's because there's not a great deal of affection for the EU. There are bad things about the EU. We must all admit that. The bureaucracy, the lack of democratic accountability, and so on. But the European ideal, in the broader sense, surely should be something we can create enthusiasm for.
Anything about the European ideal?
You don't hear about it.
Nobody's mentioned it.
The thing is, though, I think you just said the lack of democratic accountability. It's the world's most democratic multi-nation organisation.
Yes,
it's far more democratic than the UK, which has 820 unelected lords. So what you've just said is actually what we're being told to think. NATO can take us to World War III against the wishes of the people if somebody attacks another NATO member. That's a hell of a lot of sovereignty. We didn't elect anybody to NATO. If we leave the EU, what we're going to do? Trade through? We do the Norway deal, fair enough. But so, do we elect the World Trade Organization? No. Do we elect the World Bank? Do we elect the governor of the Bank of England? No. So actually, the EU is so democratic that you can even get 4% of the vote and get UKIP MEPs from Scotland, which is almost unheard of. It's that democratic. So I would actually argue.
Democracy is not always a good thing.
I would argue against democracy.
My thing is, at the outset of all this debate, the Remain campaign, of all people, should have known and did know this is going to be a really hard sell. It's going to be really hard to get people engaged. We're going to have to devise different ways, and we're going to have to get really smart people, and we're going to have to devise different ways of communicating this message. And if that's happened, I've missed it.
And plus, you've seen the total cynicism of people who have destroyed the NHS for year after year, suddenly thinking, what are people like? Oh yeah, the NHS. Let's say that the EU is the enemy of the NHS. Or Ian Duncan-Smith, who is now literally, apparently, a completely different person. Or maybe he was evil twins, and now the good Ian Duncan-Smith has locked the bad Ian Duncan-Smith, who killed and drove to suicide disabled people for 6 years, back in the cellar. So you're seeing the absolute emperor's clothes element of people who are basically going for whatever they think will be popular, and that there's some kind of belief system in there, but actually it's very shaky.
But the politics of it, and politics is what I've done for most of my journalistic career, is that the Yes side made great play of the way in which Labour campaigned alongside the Tories in that campaign. I'm convinced that has made SNP in particular too reticent about getting stuck into this campaign, because they're going to look like they will be open to the accusation, you're campaigning with Osborne and Cameron, shoulder to shoulder, and yet you said that was bad when Labour did it. Now, it's difficult, but they've got to find a way through that. And I think it can be done. And of course, the obvious way to do it is to say, well, yeah, for the time being, sure, Cameron and Osborne are bad, but look at the alternative. That's who's going to win power at Westminster. I think Nicola Sturgeon said that.
I was going to say that. I think more recently they've kind of got that idea right. Okay, this lot aren't great. But look at what's waiting in the wings.
Yeah.
The key issue with Labour campaigning alongside the Tories, you can campaign alongside other people quite comfortably. It depends on how you do it. And what Labour did during the independence referendum wasn't so much campaign alongside them, but actually out-Tory the Tories. The statements they made when it came to the evidence submitted to the Smith Commission, they put a heck of a lot less powers in their package than the Tories did. So they didn't campaign alongside the Tories, they showed they were the Tories, and that's why it backfired on them so much. But yeah, there is reticence within the SNP, within, there are business people who I've said, I'd like you to step forward and your business is really important. EU is very important to your business, where you step forward and do an interview. No, I don't want to be associated with a scaremongering campaign. So it's kind of flipped to a certain extent, and
because some of the language you see now, I mean, I think it was the Telegraph leader today, some of the language they used to justify a Leave vote was exactly the same language that you would have used to justify a yes vote in the independence referendum. You could argue about the context and the truth or otherwise of the statements, but the language was...
The language is the same, but the unions are different. One's a trading organisation, the other is a government.
But it's almost as if they lifted it, Robbie.
Well, yeah.
That was a good line, let's take that.
But the other thing is that if you look at today's main broadsheet headlines from London in the Sunday papers, they are indistinguishable from the ones that came out long ago, in the midst of time, at the start of this long campaign, where it was all about Leave and it will be a disaster. We'll get the Bank of England governor to say that, we'll get the IMF to say that. The other side saying, no, you're scaremongering, it's Project Fear. Today, we've got papers back to full circle to that exact same thing. That argument has gone almost nowhere. And that, of course, has created a vacuum into which the migrant issue has poured.
Well, let's talk about immigration right now, because we had... well, first of all, this immigration issue, I would argue, is not such an issue in Scotland. Do you think that's true? As in the anti-immigrant feeling, I'm not saying it doesn't exist in Scotland, but it's not the overwhelming issue that it seems to have become in England.
I think that's fair. But one interesting thing, maybe, and it ties into what you were just saying about maybe there being lack of a really strong campaign from leaders in Scotland for Remain. But it looks as though the vote in Scotland is going to be tighter than people might have thought at the beginning of the campaigns. And I'm hearing from some people really in the mix in politics who are saying that they're fearing it's going to be a lot tighter than people would have expected it to be. One thing about that, one reason for that could be the fact that the Remain campaign in Scotland hasn't been strong enough, and you have been getting all this language in the UK newspapers and media that people relate to a little bit more, maybe if they were yes voters, and it's speaking a bit more to them. Or it could be that things like immigration do matter more to people here than we probably, we do get sidetracked a little bit with this sort of progressive Scotland, giving ourselves a pat on the back stuff, which I think makes us less likely to look a bit more inward at the potentially more ugly side of what's there. So if the vote was tighter in Scotland, then I would be interested to know why. Is it just about the campaign's not been good enough, or is it because this stuff actually does matter more to people in Scotland than we like to think it does?
In London is an amazing city. It's a completely multiracial, multicultural city.
Very cosmopolitan.
Very
for a black Muslim mayor.
Completely.
Quite happily.
Absolutely. Very happily. Is immigration an issue there?
I mean, in pockets, in the same way as there's much more immigration, but factually, it's a city that's been multicultural since before the days of Shakespeare, and there have always been different communities, and people generally get on. If you dial up the heat, as people have, it gets more tense, because if you're told you should worry, you start worrying. But no, I mean, London's quite cosmopolitan. But it's interesting, if you look at the facts and if you look at the roots of this, basically this is an argument about who gets to lead the Tory party, and the facts really are fairly clearly that we shouldn't be leaving the EU. It's just something that you grabbed onto so you could get David Cameron's job. There's not an awful lot to talk about, and so people have looked around for what they've been drip feeding into the public imagination anyway, which is immigration. And people, you will hear the same slogans coming out all the time because people, they have, a lot of these people, David Cameron, they've worked in PR. How do you sell something? You sell comfort, you sell safety, you sell family values, you sell the idea of your community being moral and normal and nice. Okay, how do we threaten that? We say that some other community is not nice and not moral and will be a threat. And obviously, the fact is, going out of the EU won't really defend us against immigrants at all, and obviously the figures on immigration, you can argue about whether they're damaging or not damaging, but it's something to talk about that's powerful, that they've grabbed onto completely opportunistically without thinking through the impact of that. And again, you're not getting the stories, in northern England when there was flooding, you didn't hear about the Syrian people who were grateful that they'd been allowed in and given a home, who immediately volunteered when the emergency staff weren't getting there or there wasn't government funding to do anything. So they were there, and individual villages saw people doing something and doing a human helping thing. You don't hear about the refugees thing up here.
I think there's a bit of confusion there as well about because the refugee crisis tends to just be called a migration crisis now, or just migration. And there's a lot of confusion over the long-term immigration debate when it comes to the EU and the latest, the refugee crisis and what's been going on there. And I've found that on social media a real, just complete ignorance that the two things should be looked at differently, that it's not the same thing. So, yeah, I mean, in Scotland maybe, I don't know, after, with the refugee crisis and a lot of Scottish communities taking refugees in, I'm from the Isle of Bute, which was famously took in refugees, and I'm kind of connected to some of that stuff on social media because I'm from there, and I saw stuff that horrified me coming from people that I would never have expected to see, including actually one of my old bosses, who I thought I knew well enough to know his views on certain things, and I was really surprised by some of the language that was used, some of the accusations that were being made, and just the rhetoric and the suspicion and the willingness to put that forward about these new people in the community. So I wonder whether that kind of fear and suspicion, because Scotland can't be immune to that hostile environment that's been created, I wonder whether it does seep in a little bit more, but we tend to just like the nice headlines about, isn't it great, Isle of Bute took in Syrian refugees, hooray, but there could be a problem on the side of that. If we don't address it, then...
But there's no strategy, there's no discussion of... there are tensions, and the last generation of immigrants, they have a problem that's different with the new, because they feel that the next, that will be too many migrants and I'll get into, there's a whole complex relationship of things that go on, and we're not talking about any of that. And meanwhile, you've got ISIS, which certain parts of it, and al-Nusra and all of these people, they're quite media savvy, and they want the rape stories. They want the terror to be there. They want to be as terrifying as possible. So they're also feeding into the same migrant-hating agenda, because they want people to stay with them and be crushed by the caliphate. So there's a whole load of influences out there.
Rob, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, because I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, that when people are exposed to very negative media about immigration, of course that prejudices them, but we know that there's no greater cure for that than knowing some migrants, right? Yeah. So all the statistics show that anti-immigration parties get their biggest votes down south in places where there is the least amount of immigration. Though strangely, Scotland bucks the trend a little bit there. There's not so many immigrants living in Scotland, and yet anti-immigration parties get very low votes at elections. There was a really interesting article I read the other day that suggested that's got something to do with Scotland as a country where migration is part of its national fabric. It's difficult to hate immigrants if you spent your childhood sending shortbread to your cousins in Canada, right? But one set of statistics that really interests me is the UK Social Attitude Survey that was published back in January, I think, that showed people who've studied at colleges and universities tend to have much less xenophobic and racist attitudes. And the analysis of that is that when you study at a college or university, you're exposed to people from all over the world. You're in an international space. The best cure for anti-immigrant sentiment is migration, is opening borders, is free movement, and creating a more multicultural society.
So how do you, UKIP, they had the poster famously this week. How I guess the question is, do you allow UKIP to say these things? And if so, how can you then complain about the effect of it?
Well, you have to allow them. If you live in a democracy, you have to allow people to say what they want to say. The minute you don't live in a democracy, and you actually add power to extreme views. So yes, you do. But let's be clear here. The EU referendum has an immigration element to it. But what we're voting on is EU immigration. That poster didn't have a single European in it.
Yeah.
It's the wrong immigrants. And people are confusing these two issues, because whether you're in the EU or not isn't going to make any difference, because if our army and air force start bombing places in the Middle East, then there will be immigrants, there will be refugees. You know,
Does it need to be accurate?
But when it comes down to we're going to look at the EU immigration. EU immigrants are 33% more likely to have a degree than we are. They pay on average 45% more tax than British-born people do. In 2013-14, after you've deducted all of the benefits that they actually were able to claim, EU immigrants generated a profit for the United Kingdom Treasury of £2.5 billion. It's not EU immigrants that are a problem if immigration is a problem, and that's what people are actually voting for, the wrong immigration.
And if you believe in neoliberal Darwinian capitalism, the fact that they've got here alive means that they've justified their place in our economy.
I've never heard that before,
because
but
the journey did not kill them, and if you genuinely believe in all of that shit, you know, these people are the people that you should be giving the directorships
But
to.
this shift between what the debate, and a small aspect of the debate, might have been about Polish plumbers, but it was never that. As the rest of the campaign over the economy and Project Fear and all the rest of it bashed each other to a standstill, we were left with this gaping void. And UKIP have led the charge into that gaping void by making this about migration. Not EU migration, migration of coloured people. And that's what that poster said the other day. That's why it was described today by, I think, George Osborne as vile and disgusting. And whether we make the causal link, we can, of course. But when you create that climate, bad things happen. I think that's where we're moving on to.
I think you kind of can. But I mean, in a healthy media environment, journalists are saying, okay, you know, all of the things that we've just said, all of the people in that queue are black. Can you explain how the, you know, and that's not coming. You've got this learned helplessness in what's supposed to be the progressive bit of the media, and you've got other parts of the media who are basically just half a step behind UKIP and just going along in that rolling kind of wave. And it's utterly irresponsible.
The irony of the whole situation is that right now we've got people from war-torn states and the Middle East in particular coming here. Just wait 25 years until global warming kicks off, and there's 10 million Africans having to walk in this direction. Then you might want to be part of a concerted effort to deal with it. You know, unless we deal with you know. So there are bigger issues in this. We're having a petty political referendum that nobody in this country particularly wanted.
And nobody is saying, you know, is looking at World War II. I mean, we're actively avoiding looking at World War II. World War II, if you think of the Poles alone that we took in after World War II, that was 300,000 Polish people who came just after World War II, apart from all of the other hundreds of thousands of people. And you're getting this, our way of life is threatened, our way of life. Our way of life is made up of Polish immigrants, is made up of I think we took in an entire regiment of SS people, the Baltic SS people, because we thought they would be biddable and nice breeding stock, because we were a little bit weird even just after World War II. We took in people from everywhere because we needed them, and we took them in when we had no housing stock because London had been flattened, Birmingham had been flattened, Clydebank had been flattened, Coventry had been flattened. You think we're full now? We just didn't have any bloody houses and we had no infrastructure. Our way of life, nobody is talking about this. Our way of life is a construct of immigration. And nobody's saying that. Our way of life that we defend every generation from the new and the other, and amazingly it's still there for the next generation to say, ooh, our way of life is threatened.
Actually, one person said that. She said it in her maiden speech to the House of Commons.
Yeah, there you go.
And there's vigils for her today.
Yeah. Jo Cox, the traitor.
I mean, her maiden speech, and I must admit it passed me by at the time, but because they've been showing it more recently, to stand up in your maiden speech and say, in my constituency, Irish Catholics, Muslim people from India, Muslim people from Pakistan, they add more, they enhance us. And it was a very brave speech, and who knows, that may have been a trigger.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to talk about Jo Cox in a way it doesn't sound glib, because it was just obviously, I mean, it doesn't bear repeating how horrific it is and how, I guess, dignified her family have been in the aftermath of that. I mean, we've had very moving statements from her husband in today's paper, her sister, and it is incredibly moving and difficult to talk about. I suppose what is the area around that which is subject to discussion currently is the atmosphere of vilification of politicians, and therefore we have a shrill political debate in this country driven largely by social media. And
is it former journalist? Is it really?
No, okay. I'm not stating my opinion.
Louder than every front page every morning.
Okay.
Come on, really?
Okay. You obviously don't. You think the media itself shoulders some responsibility for that.
BBC Breakfast, good morning, this is who you should be scared of. I can't watch that shit. My mother comes and watches that in the morning. If you're not used to it, it's a horrific shock. What should you worry about now? I mean, it's not. I mean, yeah, the social media is there too, and it becomes an echo chamber, and that's very negative. But that's not all that's happening.
I think the problem on social media is more about direct targeting of individuals and politicians. That's something that would have been much, much harder to do before the days of social media. You would have had to go to great lengths in order to threaten someone, and if you did go to those lengths, there was probably a higher chance that you were going to get caught, because there was a more physical trail behind it. On social media, police find it very hard. I think Twitter's an American company, so there's questions about legal jurisdiction and stuff. It can be really difficult to track down the people that are responsible for that stuff. It can be almost impossible to know whether a threat is going to be a really serious threat or whether it's going to be... I mean, we've had... in Scotland, Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh came out just quite recently, within the last couple of weeks, I think, and said that she had been on the receiving end of threats, and it was something that she hadn't really spoken about all that publicly. She certainly won't be the only one, and after what's happened to Jo Cox, I can only imagine that some politicians will be in really serious fear now, because they've seen actually this can lead to something.
Has it changed political discourse? Has it changed, Gordon, do you think it's changed political discourse?
What, the threats?
The way that Twitter has social media changed political discourse?
Oh, there's idiots on all sides of all political arguments, and what's happened is that instead of saying these things and it doesn't go any further than the pub, they're able to say these things and it can go a bit further, and then somebody can take offence at it. If it's changed anything, it's the amount of offence that people are taking nowadays.
They're quick to be offended.
Oh yeah, and they'll even try and read the things that I say, and then they get comments saying I take particular offence at this, and it's actually I'd said the exact opposite of what you've taken offence at. So it's just like it's now a political tool to take mock offence at something rather than actually answer the hard questions.
I mean, there's an element of that. I think there are sometimes politicians who fall back, which really infuriates me, fall back on the abuse thing as a reason not to engage in a discussion. We've seen that definitely has happened, and that's appalling because it really does a disservice to the people that are struggling.
So
but I mean, on the it's stuff that you would have said in a pub. In terms of what happens to women in particular, I don't think men go down the pub and talk about raping women, and that's just something that you would have said in pop culture. There's something that's more specific and targeted.
You're in your own home, you feel safe, you're anonymous, and I mean, they should teach basic psychology in every class, in every school, to just go through situations in which people will be liable to behave in unhealthy ways in situations when they weren't. If you're in your own home, if you've got no oversight, if you're anonymous, you're more liable to do things you would never do face to face. It's like being in a car. You're much more.
But that can have a real effect.
It's true.
Rob.
No. And now you don't know if when the nutter tweets at you whether it's a 12-year-old in his mum's bedroom or somebody who's going to hunt you down. Yeah.
Rob, I keep asking you to be a spokesman for journalists. You're today's Bob Dylan. But people like myself, social media is something it's happened. People like yourself, social media has pretty much always been there. It's part of. So I guess you look at it differently than I look at it.
Yeah, very much so. And I don't want to retread too much the conversation about whether Twitter has made us more terrible people, because I think that's a well-discussed thing. I think maybe it's certainly given us more access to, more opportunity to distribute abuse and be horrible to each other. But I think there's something else that we need to look at too, and it's picking up on the point you made about the vitriol that we see in mainstream media as well. There's been a hollowing out of politics that makes it easier to target individuals for their decisions and their actions, rather than saying that it's part of the reason they do things politically, right? So an interesting example is the way that Nigel Farage is often described as being a racist and having aggressive and obnoxious views, rather than saying that those follow from his divisive politics. And the reason that that's made possible by mainstream media is that the newspapers are doing it as well. They don't want the newspapers don't want you to read an article and say, "Ooh, this sounds quite a lot like the editorial on the other page," when they're talking about what Nigel Farage has said. They want you to think this newspaper has an opinion, Nigel Farage has an opinion, and there's no particular link. But there's a political base to it.
Yeah.
I'm going to... Sorry.
I wanted to talk about how what happened on Thursday, how it will impact the debate and the campaign in the coming up days, and whether or not it will have an impact beyond that. I mean, we saw the campaign suspended. We saw the Tories saying they wouldn't contest the by-election. We've seen today, and reading on Twitter on the Andrew Marr show, the language that was being used by the politicians was less aggressive. It's how will it change, and will it change in a lasting way, Robbie?
I doubt it. I think it will have an effect next week. I suspect that. Well, you can tell right away that the initial reaction from the Leave side was mock outrage that people would seek to make political capital out of this. In fact, they were saying that before anyone did. And as it emerged that the person accused of this crime, did appear to have far right-wing connections, it became more obvious. Some papers were still trying to play up the mental health line and say, well, he was a crazed loner. And you say, well, possibly, but if you subscribe to racist Nazi views and you have mental health problems, you've still got racist Nazi views. They didn't come out of nowhere. They didn't come out of a vacuum. So we can't go into the details of his case because he's now standing trial. But I think that it will affect this coming week. I think it will force UKIP to be less strident. I think it makes the likelihood of, put it this way, if that poster launched the other day had been planned for this week, would they have gone ahead with it?
No.
Probably not. So I think it'll have an effect. Whether it has an effect in the long term is a different question. I hope it doesn't have the effect of making elected politicians withdraw from having a full engagement with their voters, because that would be a really terrible loss. But if it makes us all think more about the kind of material in the media that fosters hate, whether it be hatred of refugees, as they really are, as you said, at home, or whether it be hatred of gay people. You've got the horror in Orlando, you've got the bus driver banning 2 gay people from his bus. Actions that inculcate hate generally, we're going to have to get much harder on. And I agree it can't involve anything that goes against freedom of speech. But I do think we need to...
I'd like to see that more responsible media culture, but I think back to the little boy, Alan Kurdi, that died, and how, even the Daily Mail, the newspapers that you tend to associate more with the anti-immigrant rhetoric really strongly, they all had these very compassionate front pages, and it led to the UK government taking in refugees, and all this happened, but it wasn't very long before that was kind of forgotten, and we just reverted right back to where we've been before.
You just have to keep pushing. I mean, the thing you've got to remember is that almost nothing penetrates that Westminster culture, but this is one of their own.
Yes.
And I mean, I think last year they did a survey of MPs, and almost all of them already felt physically threatened, partly because of the disconnect between Westminster and actual, constituencies. And I think you might find, if you think of the last 2 MPs who were murdered by the IRA, and if you think of Westminster's reaction to the IRA, I mean, they weren't pro-IRA already, but I mean, they became very savagely set. And I think it will be interesting to see how they react to the right, particularly as they're also trying to court the right, because UKIP is apparently gaining ground and has the support of so many newspapers. It's going to be interesting.
There is a precedent. The Swedish referendum on adopting the euro, Foreign Minister Anna Lindh was stabbed to death. She was arguing for adopting the euro. The polls turned and they adopted the euro. So it has had that effect already. It's quite eerily similar. But I don't know the background of the person who committed that murder, but the issue this time around is that although there allegedly are links to Britain First, if it was UKIP, then it'd be a whole different ballgame. Yeah. Because this is a fringe organisation that even UKIPers look down on and say that it doesn't impact on me. You know, they say, well, I'm actually I want immigration, but I want controlled immigration, whereas, you know, that's a hate organisation. Yeah. But, you know, so how it will impact on it, I think if the referendum was now, was tomorrow, I think it would impact quite strongly. By the time we hit Thursday, I'm not entirely sure that it will make that much of a difference. If it does, it will be a 1 or 2%. But it does give the Leave campaign, how to put this, it will give them a problem. I think it also gives them an excuse if they don't deliver it. I think we're going to end up in, oh wait a minute, there were special circumstances to us losing by 2%. I think it just opens, that, you know, there's going to be, this whole argument's not going to go away. It's not going to be as decisive as Cameron thought it would be.
I think Corbyn's idea of talking about Joe Wood and having MPs not face each other and maybe just sitting together and not being delineated by parties sort of geographically within the House is a really good idea. And also quite realistic, because these people, although they do the Yahoo sucks politics, which affects and poisons all of us, they have tea together, they drink together, they have much more in common with themselves and with the media, who live in that little Westminster bubble, than anybody else. It's actually much more real to look at that.
Two things I'd like to talk about, but one I can't because it's too much, too big. But I'll say it but briefly, in that we've derided the mainstream media throughout this programme, but I'm not sure that we know yet what we expect from mainstream media, because let's take the UKIP poster. On the one hand, we want a straight, factual news report. They did the poster, they said this. On the other hand, some people want that straightforward news report to say, yes, but this isn't true, and then to go much further than that, and then to comment on it. And yet, when it does go from news to comment, other people say in the other way, in a way that you don't agree with, you deride them for it. So I think media itself, I think the expectations of it are different now, and I don't think we've really got there. But
that's learned helplessness again.
Yes.
You can look at the history of anti-immigrant propaganda. You can look at European history, you can look at recent European history or 20th century history, and you can factually report this is a country where there was a lot of propaganda and nothing terrible happened. This is you can still do the factual, nuanced report.
Yeah.
And the media's just lying back and doing celebrity gossip and advertisement porn and hate porn. Enough already.
But even, I feel as if I have to stand up, but I'm going to, because even in the midst of revolutions, the papers sometimes find room in their columns for things that are something else, that are lighter, because they have a responsibility to
columns, spaces, and they also, you're not getting, today in London, people are kissing each other in an attempt to break the world record for Guinness Book of World Records for kissing, but primarily to say love is love. It's a necessary thing, it's a desperately necessary thing now, and in solidarity with what happened in Orlando, straight people, gay people, whatever people are going to express love in order to say, we're doing the other thing. That isn't on the front page of any papers. That could be a lighter thing.
It could, absolutely.
The Quakers bring out a newspaper about people doing things. I'm wearing my wee badge that says, sometimes if you want something to exist in the world, you have to make it yourself. People all over the world are doing that.
I think that there's an issue with sweeping generalisations when it comes to media, though, is that we tend to talk about the media has filled our heads with this, the media has ignored this, the media hasn't covered that. I might be reading a different media, but I've read quite a lot of commentary columns about maybe Nigel Farage's poster or about the campaign's misleading us on facts. I've read a lot of stuff within our existing media.
It's kind of
maybe it's
definitely,
different.
it really is now
but
quite
it's not that it doesn't exist at all.
No,
maybe it's
no.
not as good as it should be, but it's not
it's
that
minor and that it really
yeah,
is
but
quite sick.
we kind of make the media this big one monstrous thing, and then everybody's suspicious of all of it, when actually no, there are bits of our media that are very
and
good.
it's not a
and good
conspiracy,
job.
it's partly commercial press, it's partly lack of training, it's partly lack of sub-editors training new up-and-coming journalists.
But there's also an issue with
research.
different priorities. I mean, that to you might, that story might be a great story that you would love to see on a front page, might be someone else's worst nightmare on a front page. That part of newspapers deciding front pages or what the lighter stuff is based on what they think their readership wants, not necessarily what they think their readership should be reading.
Yeah, it's the fact
There's
that that's
a
become
lot of things to balance.
a downward slope, that it's so
There was
difficult
one more
for that to
thing that you
become
wanted to say,
a
though,
downward
wasn't there? You
But I
said
think
there were
there's
two
two
things that you
people
wanted to
involved.
talk
Yeah,
about.
but there's
and
just
Yes.
sorry, but just one thing. At the time of the run-up to the Iraq War, although many newspapers were banging the drum and had already decided on no evidence, on faith-based bullshit, that we would go to war, there was a huge amount of factual information, and if you remember, all of the newspapers said, wow, our readerships have gone up. We're actually bucking the trend that we've been used to because we put facts in. We undertake to put more facts in newspapers. Lasted about a week, and then you were back to the nonsense. Partly because of commercial pressure, and partly because of the pressure of the people who own the newspapers. And yet there are lovely journalists, there are good journalists. I give money to Greg Pallas, the investigative journalist. I'm not anti-journalists. It's just there are people who are working as journalists who aren't actually being journalists. They're just writing.
The other thing I was going to raise, and we don't have time now.
Sorry.
But it's all right, because we can do next week, is, I guess, the effect of the EU referendum on independence in Scotland. But I guess if we were going to talk about that today, it's going to be just idle speculation, whereas next week when we talk about it, we'll know the result, so we'll be able to probably try, at least aim for a more informed debate. But we'll see.
So thank you. We've come to the end of our programme today. Megan D is going to come back on and play us out with our dedication to Joe Cox. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
But